While Iran's between presidents, there's room to review outgoing Rouhani's report card and envisage where Raeisi will pick up as he takes over on August the 3rd. Economic woes and wills are our focus of the day in light of foreign policy. Iran's economy was at the edge of a cliff when moderate Hassan Rouhani took office in 2013. To pull it to safety, he took a big step towards a grand plan in signing the JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal of 2015. The plan didn't materialize and Iran is where it is. But was a deal with powers west and east our only respite as a country aspiring to independence? I'm Leila Faramarzi and you're watching Iran Today. The nuclear deal with 6 world powers was to limit Iran's nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. But the US pulled out in 2018 and reimposed and reinforced sanctions. It was a deal with the devil. Still, the country wouldn't have needed that cure with a little more self-reliance and reliability in the system. Mr. Qadiri Abiane is an ex-diplomat and analyst who made the trek to the studio to give us his take on affairs. What would you say has been the government's greatest mistake and how connected to foreign policy is it?
Rouhani's administration gave people hope that the JCPOA would solve the problems and lift the sanctions. The false hope held some people off from doing projects like launching factories or building houses until the JCPOA is signed. This hope led to a stagnation in economic activities and in turn caused an economic recession. Rouhani's administration negotiated the deal. However, he gave more concession than what we obtained. The administration didn't seek any guarantee for its implementation. Therefore, not only the sanctions remained in place, but they also were intensified. This vain hope in the US hurt our economy.
Rouhani basically blames Trump's sanctions and COVID-19 for the current situation. But how correct is he, our guest tells. Mr. Sheikhi is an economist with pretty strong feelings against the current administration's performance.
You see, the coronavirus circulates around crowded spaces. Its infection has a direct relationship with how crowded places are, and as a result, it majorly affects the jobs that deal with crowded spaces, which is the service occupations. As a result, the effect of coronavirus has been mild on the production section. The 12th administration cannot hide its lack of attention to the production section behind the outbreak of coronavirus.
Mr. Dawoodi is the IRNA agency's chief of news. He came to Press TV studios to share his journalist's fair view of the situation.
Mr. Rouhani's administrations have made achievements in the past 8 years, which I think are all valuable, both in terms of economics and politics. One is that after 2015, having a nuclear program was recognized as a right for Iran by other nations, which wasn't the case before. I think this is their biggest possible achievement, although they could make more progress too. But out of bad luck, a president took office in the US who eliminated all the achievements. Trump ruined all Rouhani's plans for the country's growth.
When the nuclear deal came into force in 2016, sanctions were lifted. But the economy didn't exactly pick up, as the deal didn't bring in Iran's expected foreign investment, which would have helped privatization and hence the greatly centralized economy. And then with the US unilateral pullout, sanctions came gushing in, bringing with them a whole lot of new rubble along the way. Principalists have been mocking Rouhani's Hope campaign, his attempts to revive the JCPOA via Vienna talks that started over 3 months ago. His response? He simply suggested that they be put on the spot about whether they want sanctions relief. To what extent would you say hiccups in Iran's economy are down to foreign policy and foreign trade?
The situation we're in is a project of not only our foreign policy, but a multitude of different issues. Speaking of foreign policy, I definitely believe that the world is like a village, and we can't barricade ourselves off of the rest of the world. We can't achieve any dynamic economy without interacting with the world and our neighbors. We need to expand our foreign relations. But on the other hand, issues such as mismanagement has had serious effects on the country's conditions. We need to focus our attention on issues that could generate added value for us and disregard others that don't.
When you have managers who are in favor of westernization, of course they'll be after expanding discrimination too, because it's one of the principles of a capitalist economic system. Giving out economic rent and causing injustice are the other characteristics of a capitalist economy. The aim of an Islamic economy is promoting justice, but the capitalists seek growth by any means, no matter if a majority of people is being crushed under pressure while a few prosper. Unfortunately, Rouhani's administration tied the economy to the West. He wanted to implement a Western capitalist economy, and that's why we failed. They tied the economy to the JCPOA and the FATF.
It was on the 8th of May 2018 that the US pulled out, with sanctions ensuing in a month, which set out to target Iranian purchases of US dollars, metal trading, coal, industrial software, and Iran's auto sector, though the toughest measures targeting oil exports were not to take effect for another 4 months. US companies don't do much business with Iran, but Washington has the ability to block European and Asian firms from trading here.
Well, both sanctions and the COVID pandemic affected the economy, but we suffered the most damage from Rouhani's administration's lack of insight, which stemmed from trusting the US and Europe. After the US withdrew from the JCPOA, the administration continued its compliance with the deal, arguing that everyone else is still a party to it. This is why the Europeans have $1,400 billion worth of economic ties with the US, compared to $20 billion with Iran. Obviously, they wouldn't abandon the $1,400 billion for our $20 billion.
The Iranian economy has been adapted to sanctions of different strengths since the revolution of 1979, and so it is industrially moderately independent, but still, it is beset by high unemployment, a real currency that took a deep dip towards the end of President Ahmadinejad's term and has now taken a plunge, and it has oil exports that have gone down from under 2.5 million barrels per day to unknown lows. Now it's become better, of course. But still, this forced the country to print money without backup, and it sends the country into high inflation. Principalists were genuinely vindicated when the US binned the deal after Iran's compliance in paralyzing its nuclear program and rendering the country vulnerable to outsiders coming in as nuclear observers. But they also realized the importance of reviving the economy and that sanctions relief would be a quick step in that direction. It will be Rouhani's tragedy if they get to revive the deal he made. He has just days left in office.
If I want to mention some achievements of Mr. Rouhani's administration, we need to go back to 2015, a year that tens of billions of dollars of Iran's frozen assets were released, a year when $10 billion of Iran's frozen oil sale revenue were released by Italy, India and the UK, a year that Eni, Shell and Total came back to our oil industry. Car manufacturers like Volkswagen, Citroën, Peugeot, Renault and Mercedes came back to Iran to build their commercial products. The year we placed orders for 230 Airbus, Boeing and ATR airliners. If we remember that year, we would realize the political and economic managers of Mr. Rouhani had laid the groundwork very well.
Well, the Americans didn't provide any guarantee to lift the sanctions in practice and stay committed to their promises. Foreign Minister Zarif said the signature of the then US Secretary of State, Mr. Kerry, is a guarantee, while it couldn't have been. The signature of the US President or even the Congress aren't considered a guarantee, because they can simply back out of it. Mr. Trump took office and nullified Mr. Obama's signatures. President Biden also reversed some of Trump's orders. The Congress may pass a bill, but can pass anything else afterwards. A guarantee is valid when things go step by step, but because the administration wanted to show goodwill, it did whatever they wanted in advance. In such circumstances, why would they honor their commitments?
Here's a still more or less current price list of 2020 that may make Rouhani look like the worst president ever. But he didn't inherit a bed of roses and hasn't been readily supported with his foreign policy and trade projects. A US dollar equals about 250,000 rials. A standard gold coin would be 110 million rials. The average price of property is 200 million rials per square meter, and it's 30,000 rials per liter for gasoline. To go slightly back, Iran's economy contracted by more than 6% in both 2018 and 2019, according to IMF. That's the International Monetary Fund. It's not just sanctions. Economic ills have been exacerbated also by the coronavirus pandemic. To put figures into a context of Iran's contemporary history, here's a chart showing the rise and fall of inflation during the 5th to 12th presidencies. From a low of under 15% shortly after the Iraq-Iran war during protectionist Rafsanjani's first term as president, the inflation rose to its highest ever in his second term. That's 49%. That was classed as a reason for a reformist getting the next vote. Khatami was the name, and inflation kept at a low during his 2 terms, which ended with inflation at under 20%. Next came the controversial principalist Ahmadinejad, whose presidency experienced some turmoil. As you see, inflation made some sharp bounces up and down. His first term averaged at 16.5%, dropped to around 10% towards the end, then spiked to about 35% as his second term was ending in 2013. To bridge the gap between reformist and principalist, moderate Rouhani won the next presidency. Looking at the chart, it's as though the JCPOA president dragged inflation down with all his might to a real low of under 10% in 2016, a year before term end. That's the second time in Iran's post-revolutionary history that inflation has dropped that much. Then, with the nuclear deal having fizzled out, inflation shot up to over 40%, that's 42% actually, towards the end of Rouhani's second term in office. And now it's at 45%. We'll be back in no time. Before our next review of figures, let's do a quick media review to see what other news outlets have to say. Here it is in words. Iran Focus mentions some capacities Iran readily had, economic capacities which it has lost. Destroyed capacities of Iran's economy. In recent decades, Iran's economy has moved away from development. Political tensions and the escalation of sanctions, along with mismanagement and inefficiency of managers in various governments, have exacerbated the issue and prevented the Iranian economy from achieving growth and development, and led to the spread of poverty as much as possible. Today, Iran doesn't have stable exports and imports from neighboring countries and the world, and in trade agreements, it has not defined a reciprocal flow for any of the countries and international unions. Even now, the crushing budget deficit has flattened the Rouhani government, so higher costs mean higher inflation and more severe economic and social crises. Rouhani's term is coming to an end. Now it is up to the new government to try and solve these issues after taking office in a very near future. Tasnim talks of how Rouhani will be handing over the job to Raeisi for a gentle transition. Administration gives successor a realistic prospect of Iran's economy. Rouhani, the outgoing president of Iran, said his administration is offering a general outlook of the country's economy to its successor and will share experiences with the next administration's officials. Speaking at a meeting at the Economic Coordination Headquarters, President Hassan Rouhani said his administration has made arrangements for the transition of power with a national outlook and tries to realistically outline the country's macroeconomic plans for the next administration. Pointing to his cabinet's efforts to give transparent reports about its activities over the past 8 years, Rouhani said the people should be informed of the problems that the administration has dealt with and of the measures it has taken to nullify the sanctions and counter the economic war. The Financial Tribune gets a little more technical. Monthly PMI for overall economy drops by 4.7%. The Overall Purchasing Managers Index, known by its Farsi acronym SHAMA for Iran's overall economy, dropped in the third month of the current Iranian year, May 22 to June 21st, after emerging in the second month from a steep decline of the first fiscal month starting March the 21st. The overall PMI for Iran's economy settled at 51.27 in the month ending June the 21st from 53.84 in the month ending May the 21st, indicating a 2.57 point or 4.7% decline. A report by the Statistics and Economic Analysis Center of the Iran Chamber of Commerce, Industries, Mines and Agriculture, the sponsor and coordinator of the survey, says the reading of the index suggests that the economy is still in expansion mode. However, economic players are concerned about power outages and shortage of raw materials. Indices show economic expansion when compared with the previous month. A PMI reading of under 50 indicates contraction, and a reading of 50 implies no change. So if you've got 51.27, that's an expansion. That would be it for this segment, but do stay with us. Iran being a petropower by nature, whatever its present circumstance, it calls for a quick look at its oil and gas export revenues during the 5th to 11th presidential terms. Looking at the chart, President Rafsanjani saw oil and gas revenues rise from around $25 billion to under $40 billion in his second year in office. That's in 1990. As his second term came to an end, so did energy revenues drop to around $20 billion. With Khatami, they first dropped further, but then peaked to around $30 billion and dropped a little again. As a sign of success, revenues spiked to a high of $55 billion and more to mark the end of Khatami's presidency. Come Ahmadinejad, revenues rose and fell, as with inflation in his era. It rose to $90 billion, then fell to around $70 billion, as his first term ended in 2009. His second term saw revenues spike to around $110 billion, then crash down to around $55 billion, as he left his office behind. The lowering trend went on to about $30 billion in 2015 when Rouhani was in office. After the JCPOA of 2015 and 16, things picked up. Then again, they deflated with the US pullout and renewed sanctions during Rouhani's second term in office. Economic growth here depends mainly on oil revenues, which explains why the growth rate has been negative in recent years since sanctions renewal. Traditionally, oil revenues make up for more than 50% of Iran's budget. Here's how the Statistical Center of Iran sees economic growth panning over presidencies. The fifth government, that's Hashemi Rafsanjani's first term in office, saw a rise in economic growth to under 15% in 1989. But then it went downhill to rise moderately in 1996 and dropped to zero by the end of his second term. Come Khatami, with every fall came a rise. His highest point was about 7.5% growth in 2002. Ahmadinejad followed, starting with a gentle growth, which at its highest in 8 years hit around 7% and after some bouncing plunged to the lowest level in all 8 presidencies to about -5 at a point. With Rouhani, growth was significant. It picked up and up to about 7% and took one plunge only in his unfortunate second term to about -2%.
Of
course, there are criticisms against the administration's performance. I think insufficient work was done in the housing sector. That's why we're dealing with a very bad situation there. But speaking of the current administration's non-JCPOA related achievements, I need to point out the decision to make pensions equal. That really helped the pensioners, and I hope the draft bill is enacted, so that the change would be made permanent. The other achievement was in managing financial and credit institutions. If you can remember, we had problems with them a few years ago. But you haven't been hearing of a financial institution embezzling or stealing people's money for a few years now.
As for the new Iranian president, Ebrahim Raeisi, he centralized his campaign on fixing the economy, as a matter of fact. But he bluntly said no to the notion of getting into direct talks with his American counterpart in the early days post-election. He did give a nod to pursuing ongoing talks, however. It is to be seen if his style will work any better than other principalists who have dominated the system since parliamentary elections in February 2020. Principalists behind him appear to have recognized the potential contribution of sanctions relief to his public standing, if not to the economy. Earlier, with Rouhani at full throttle, the new parliament wasted no time in passing a bill demanding strict sanction relief deadlines for the US so that Iran would itself recommit to the deal. President Rouhani was furious, saying of his top nuclear negotiator Abbas Araghchi at the Vienna talks, he could finalize the deal as soon as today, referring to Parliament's postponement late last year. To the US, MPs' demands were impossible to meet, although the MPs themselves largely felt justified for said reasons and because they were incensed at what they called Rouhani's putting all his eggs into one basket rather than depending also on China and regional countries for trade.
Honestly, the JCPOA was a big deal, but speaking of the weaknesses of Rouhani's achievements in the past 8 years, I think we should admit that some issues could have been managed better. But to that end, the executive branch was left alone while other branches of the administration should have helped it. After the Saudi Arabian embassy was stormed, we should have reacted better and tried to normalize our relations with Arab states in the Persian Gulf. We also should have done more with relations to our ties with China and Russia.
We said economic woes don't depend wholly on foreign policy. Domestic mismanagement and corruption are no less to blame. But the government is not alone in deserving blame there either. It is but one branch of more than 3 in this country. Regarding the government's own share of blame, here's one example.
Corruption was rampant in Mr. Rouhani's administration, from his brother to the brother of his first vice president, who are now in jail. But one of Mr. Raeisi's very positive characteristics is that he's a very healthy individual and will try to choose managers who are honest. He responds very harshly to any corruption. Mr. Rouhani would increase the salaries amid the economic problems, including that of the managers, which were not proportionate to the raise ordinary people would receive.
Indeed, Iran faced problems even between 2015 and 2018 when sanctions were lifted and the administration received billions of dollars in previously frozen assets. Critics blame the administration for wasting resources, but most of the wastage was made without the administration's intervention. As an example, when foreign economic pressures affected the forex market, the Rouhani administration gave dollars at preferential rates up to 4 times cheaper than market rates to insiders. This was for them to import essential commodities. According to critics, many of the insiders who received the cheap dollars never returned the profits or even the original sums. That's presuming they didn't bring in imports. Mr. Qadiri is against the cheap dollars to begin with.
There were some wrong policies. For example, the dollar must be sold at a single rate. But the administration sold it at 4,200 2 months, which is 1/5 of its true price. Well, anyone who received the currency at that rate could make a 500% profit off of it. These are the wrong policies that we witnessed during other administrations too. The currency rates need to be real. The administration should determine its price on the stock market and not in meetings so it can change it however it wants every single day.
Rouhani's administration made the least efforts to implement principles of resistance economy, while, as the leader of the Islamic Revolution said, it isn't a new phenomenon. The Westerners, the Americans, Europeans, British and French have been supporting their domestic production for 300 years, which is a main principle of resistance economy. They took that formula but are dictating privatization and abandoning domestic production to us.
That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do join us again at the same times next week and each week after, as you never know what's going to be on. Till then, bye.